Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave. How are you this week, Linda?
I'm fine.
Well, we got some belated news from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who got a special dispensation to actually release the Consumer Price Index data and collect it for that matter. And it turns out that in September, inflation went up to an annualized rate of 3%. That is not a big jump, but it is an increase over the previous number. And it's good news for Social Security recipients because they're going to get a raise based on that. The bad news is everything they're going to buy is going to be more expensive, so it's probably a net wash. The inflation rate, in particular, is hits other goods unevenly. So some goods and services have gone up dramatically, like airplane tickets. Others, like natural gas, have gone down. Tariffs are beginning to take a bite. The prices of imported goods are going up. The prices of domestic goods that are replacing goods that are no longer coming in because of tariffs are going up as well. So we're seeing steel prices go up as an input. That just bodes for more price increases to come. The auto industry, which has held firm, has said their inventories are running down, and thus a price increase is going to have to come fairly soon.
So I would like to tell our loyal listener who may also, like me, be on Social Security, that the Consumer Price Index for this month will not result in an increase of benefits until next year.
Right, right.
So don't spend that money yet.
Oh, yeah. Right. This is the monthly report that they use to set the cost of living adjustment for next year. Yeah.
Right. So inflation is increasing is the bottom line.
A bit. The important thing is it wasn't a big jump, so we would expect that the Federal Reserve would go ahead and lower interest rates another 25 basis points, which is 0.25%.
Okay. So that means that borrowing money will be slightly less expensive,
That's right.
but consumer goods will increase in price.
Right.
I see. Okay. So where we were is where we still are.
Yes. The horizon is uncertain, as it has been since January. That's almost becoming ordinary.
Yeah.
There's a certain certainty in the uncertainty day to day, but the economy is about the same as it was.
Does the Bureau of Labor Statistics have a head yet?
No, no. The director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics position is open. And they're looking for apparently another incompetent that they can put in who can get Senate approval.
Yeah, who won't make the female senators mad? Because that's what happened last time.
Which is apparently the criteria. Yeah.
I'm going to start with the Time cover that will come out November 10th of our dear leader, Donald Trump. But I also wanted to talk about the International Court of Justice finding with regard to Israel's responsibility to allow aid into Gaza from the UNRWA.
Remind me what the UNWRA is.
Well, the initials don't actually go with the function for some reason, but it was formed in 1948 when millions of Palestinians were driven out of their homeland in what is now Israel to the Gaza Strip, to the West Bank, and to other countries. And it was set up by the UN specifically to provide aid and support to the Palestinian refugees. And it has since then been the primary provider of education, medical services, nutritional services. In other words, those things needed to sustain a community of stateless individuals. But I first want to start with Donald Trump taking the time, because he is a trivial person, out of his victory lap with regard to the so-called ceasefire in Gaza, to rail against his Time magazine cover photo for the November 10th issue, which Time released on X, pretty much close to the time Trump was flying back from Egypt. And just in case our loyal listener has not seen it, it's an extreme upshot of Trump's head, backlit by sunlight, showing him with an uplifted jaw, suggesting the pose favored by Benito Mussolini. It's a low-angle photograph of the head of a leader is usually intended to elevate his or her status, importance, heroism, and power. Certainly, that's the ostensible purpose of the Time cover photo, which has 3 titles: His Triumph, The Leader Israel Needed, and How Gaza Heals. Trump wasn't impressed by the captions. He wrote on Truth Social that the picture, quote, may be the worst of all time, really weird. I never liked taking pictures from underneath angles, but this is a super bad picture and deserves to be called out. What are they doing and why? Now that is really a good question. The focal point of the photograph is Trump's dangling neck waddles. Both Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel made fun of Trump's neck, and Colbert was especially crude, calling it a neck vagina. The ambiguity assigned to this image hints at the current trend toward holding the mirror up to Trump through parody. It's also a useful way to introduce a discussion of how the media frames news stories and how the framing in turn sets the agenda not only for what is covered but how.
Well, Linda, what do you mean by media framing?
Well, good question. I'm sure a loyal listener wants to know too. Framing was defined in 1993 by media scholar Robert Entman. In its most reduced form, it is how the media, quote, selects some aspects of perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text, close quote. I'm sure that clears it right up for you.
Oh, yeah, crystal.
The frame emerging in the coverage of the Gaza deal is Trump forged a peace deal, or did he? On the one hand, he is the hero of the hour. On the other hand, the peace deal may be a nothing burger. There will be no phase 2 because Hamas will not surrender its arms. So that's why that photograph seems to convey 2 different meanings. Mm-hmm. One is, he's the hero of Israel, and the other is, really? Really? Should we accord him that much honor? Mm-hmm. The most oft-repeated narrative explaining how the ceasefire came about is that it cascaded, to use one metaphor in the coverage, from Netanyahu's failure to kill the bad guys when he ordered a missile strike in Qatar, a reversal of the gunfight of the OK
Yes, that seemed like a really strange incident. I can't imagine why the outrage wasn't greater when Netanyahu bombed a sovereign country and then missed the target. And Qatar, showing great restraint, responded, but did so in such a way as to not do any damage to life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, they showed, well, and they're hosting. They're the host country for the Hamas negotiators, who were in fact the targets of the missile strike. So really not good. And this explanation that it was Trump's being so upset at what Netanyahu did because they're relying on Qatar to broker talks with Hamas is really a simple cause and effect narrative of the kind that we discussed in our last podcast. It's unrealistic because one cause is assigned to a very complex issue, in this case, bringing about quote-unquote peace in the Middle East, and one person is given the role of the prime mover, in this case, Donald Trump. But there are always complex causes when there's a complex issue, and they depend on more than one factor and more than one person.
The notion that one person could broker peace in a week in the Middle East, given what's gone on there since the end of World War II, is beyond ridiculous. It's also utterly surprising that this narrative has survived even a couple of hours except in the mind of Donald Trump.
Well, but it is a narrative frame that's being put around the story by the press. It's frequently referred to, often discussed, which is what I mean by frame.
Yeah.
It reduces the complexity. It also doesn't quite delve deeply enough into the story. Trump has developed close ties with Qatar, as has his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is now, of course, in Israel at this recording. In 2022, Kushner was investigated by the Senate Finance Committee for potential conflict of interest in using funding from the government of Qatar to fund a bailout of Kushner's property development. Kushner was accused of urging then-President Trump to support a blockade led by Saudi Arabia against Qatar while Kushner's company was seeking a $1 billion bailout, which it received. In other words, a kind of advanced form of blackmail. In 2024, Kushner announced his private equity firm, Affinity Partners, raised $1.5 billion. Some of it came from Qatar's sovereign investment fund. So using the potential for a blockade as leverage saved Kushner's business.
It is interesting that this was from the sovereign investment fund. That's when the government uses its money to invest as a way of supporting its own well-being. Generally, it's done in the country and not to bail out failed developers.
Yes, I think that's probably right.
And
yeah,
that's kind of an odd bit of shenanigans.
Yeah, a bit of shenanigans. And yet when you say, oh, Trump just got angry and at Netanyahu, and so that's what led to all this, it kind of glosses things over. That Saudi-led call for a blockade came because of Qatar's alliance with Iran, because they share oil fields. Its support of the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations that emerged during the Arab Spring, and because Qatar owns the Al Jazeera network, which is consistently critical of Saudi Arabia. Regrettably, we have probably entered once again into the magical thinking that Trump has perfected. In other words, he and he alone can construct peace in the Middle East. He and he alone did it because of pressure he put on Netanyahu for firing off his missiles, or firing off his missiles and missing. We don't know which was more important.
Though it possibly created more opportunities for real estate development in Qatar.
Not a joke. Not a joke. Zohar Palti is an expert who led the Mossad Intelligence Directorate as the counterterrorism chief. So I turn to him because he probably knows what he's talking about. He is now the Andrew Viterbi Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He sees a fatal flaw in the current plan to exclude Hamas from either a military or civilian role in governing Gaza. Quote, "Who's going to do it?" he said. "If somebody think that with a magic stick you're achieving this revolution in hours or days, forget about it. It's not going to happen, not because I'm pessimistic, because I'm realistic." In conclusion, the framing of the ceasefire credits Trump with bullying the parties to an agreement and emphasizes its fragility. Some sources also note that the fragility is due to the vague nature of the proposal itself. In other words, the framing allows for the heroic stance of Trump on the one hand, while also painting a picture of him as not really worthy of all the accolades.
I think we should take a moment here and talk about the complexity of the problem faced. Gaza. Gaza does not have an independent economy. It doesn't have a currency. The Palestinian Monetary Authority uses both Israeli currency, Jordanian currency, and U.S. currency to operate their economy, some of which is coming in as wages from Israel, some as donations from Jordan or remittances from Jordan, and some in the United States, both in the form of aid and remittances, plus sales. You know, I think tourism's probably done for a while in Gaza, but that's now among the donors to the Palestinians and Gaza in particular. The European Union is the largest donor, or one of the largest donors, and it donates primarily for humanitarian organizations and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Qatar, the country, is a major donor to Gaza, sending hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes with Israeli approval. Saudi Arabia also has contributed billions to the Palestinians, supporting their budget in various sectors like health, education, and infrastructure. The United States has also provided billions in aid, primarily through the lamented USAID, but also through contributions to the UN Relief and Works Agency, which you're going to talk about in a little while.
Yes.
The funds have been cut in the first Trump administration. Biden restored it, and now it's been cut again, as you will describe. The militant groups in Gaza are supplied by Iran, funding from Iran, and other Hamas revenue streams. Now, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that when we're talking about Hamas and revenue streams, Hamas is the governmental organization in Gaza.
Right.
Which is why Israel has funded militia groups within Gaza to oppose Hamas's ability to dictate the political and economic conditions and uses of funds. So there is this peculiar thing that Israel is funding these militias which are opposing Hamas, while also simultaneously funding Hamas, because it is the only agency for distributing funds anywhere throughout Gaza. They're playing both sides here financially, and it's a little disturbing. The Palestinian banks in Gaza are gone. A lot of the banking is done through ATM machines, and of course the ATM machines have all blown up. The destruction has affected all of Gaza's banking infrastructure, including 93% of the bank branches and 98% of the whole banking system. So cash is being used. So anybody who happened to hold on to cash or have access to remittances that they can get electronically through their phone or something, digital wallets or technology, has some. Of course, there's always recourse to precious metals and other forms of tangible wealth that people can exchange for necessary goods and services, and that means you're also devolving into some strange forms of barter and probably a great deal of black market activity going on. Now, when we're talking about black market, we're meaning outside the regulatory structure of the economy. So, for example, if you picking up health care needs and I'm over at the food bank, and we exchange that barter transaction, technically that's off the books and part of the black market, and that's perfectly reasonable. But then you also have to include the selling of illegal goods, the smuggling of goods, and various forms of criminal activity in that, which are certainly going to go up because the need is so desperate. And of course, the aid isn't getting there.
Well, I would like to say thank you for explaining the economy, because when you look at the level of devastation, you have to wonder, what are they using as money? How are they getting by day to day? And it's crushing. It's really crushing to think about this.
And when they talk about the people suffering from malnutrition and in danger of starving to death, that tells you it's not working. In other words, this is one person against another. One group gets aid, other groups don't get aid. There's no sort of systematized distribution of the necessities of life at this time in Gaza, and that is largely not because donors have not made arrangements to do that, but that Israel will not allow the aid to be delivered.
Well, exactly, and that's what I wanted to talk about. Just within the last 24 hours, the International Court of Justice has ruled on a case where Israel is not allowing the relief, particularly of food, medical supplies, water, that is humanitarian aid, to get into the Gaza, particularly through the major crossing point at Rafah. And the International Court of Justice ruled against Israel and found that it has an absolute responsibility as the occupying power to allow the UN Relief Organization to provide that service and goods to Gaza. And then, just before we started today, we learned that Marco Rubio has said that the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which is the UNRWA, is not going to play any role in aid delivered in Gaza. And he also rejected the possibility of Hamas being involved in any future governance of the Strip. Well, the second part is not surprising. But he was speaking at a news conference. He is in Israel at the moment. And we're recording this on Friday. And he is, after all, whether we like it or not, our Secretary of State. So he claims that the UNRWA has become a subsidiary of Hamas, and this is the claim made by the Israeli government. And it is the one that was specifically discredited by the International Court of Justice, saying there's no evidence that the UNRWA is somehow a Hamas-driven agency. In response, the UNRWA insisted that its presence, quote, remains vital to meeting urgent humanitarian needs, close quote, especially in those bombarded and starving enclaves, where the Israeli offensive has killed, I would say by a low estimate, 68,000 people. Well, I wanted to talk briefly about the UNRWA, where it comes from, what the allegations from Israel are, whether they have any legitimacy, and in fact, how devastating it is that the United States would say we're not going to let that aid in. Our loyal listener is old enough, I'm sure, to remember the film Lawrence of Arabia, which told the story of T.E. Lawrence, who during World War I organized the Arab tribes to fight against the Turks, to overcome the Ottoman Empire, starring the ever-lovely, blue-eyed Peter O'Toole. And nobody ever looked better on a camel going across the desert. Well, that's where this story starts. During World War I, the British promised supportive of T.E. Lawrence and what he was telling the Arabs, that they would support a pan-Arabian state after the end of the war and after they drove out the Ottoman Empire. And so did they live up to this after the war? Well, no, they did not. And in a way, they betrayed Lawrence, but they certainly betrayed the Arabs who had allied to get rid of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, it was during World War I that Zionists were promised a state. And this was in exchange for, it was actually a weapons deal. It was an agreement that had to do with making available to Britain patents for certain kinds of explosives. So that's what the Balfour Agreement was really about. So now you have the British, who were always, I suppose, making deals about their empire. Running an empire is not easy. It's never easy, and so they just made it up as they went along.
It's funny, as I was walking into our studio today in the library, I passed the 4-volume set on how to manage an empire in the economics section.
There's a 4-volume set on how to manage an empire?
How to manage the empire.
Well,
I should have brought it in.
Yeah, we should be reading aloud from it, I suppose. But anyway,
you
they
can take that aside.
they promised the same land to two different forces, and they also changed their alliance more than one. So at the end of World War I, Britain has conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Turks. At the same time, the Arab nationalist organizations begin to emerge to say, wait a minute, we want something else. We're not interested in what you're talking about. And in 1920, the Allied powers granted Palestine to Britain as a mandate, and the mandate was to prepare it for self-rule. And as might be expected, there were riots in Jerusalem against the Balfour Declaration and the demand that a unique Arab identity be recognized. And notice at this time, they were calling the Palestinians Arabs. They were linking them all together, even though there are Palestinian Christians, there are Palestinian Muslims, by far the dominant religion. There were Palestinian Jews, by far the smallest representation. And they had their own culture, they had their own identity, but they were lumped together with the Arabs. In 1929, Arab rioters, and this would involve Arabs from outside the Palestinian area as well as Palestinians, killed about 200 Jews in Jerusalem, in the Old City and in Hebron. And then British troops killed 116 Arabs to suppress the riots. So now the alliance shifts. In 1929, when Arab rioters killed about 200 Jews in Jerusalem and Hebron, British troops joined in with the Zionists to kill 116 Arabs to suppress the riots in Jerusalem. But in response to those riots, the British recommended limiting Jewish immigration because part of the problem was that more and more Jews had been coming into the Palestinian territory throughout the 20s and certainly in the 30s in response to repression in Europe. As a result, nothing good happened. Beginning in 1930 and for the next 5 years, a group called the Black Hand Islamist Group launched a campaign of violence against the Jewish community and also the British rule. And so now there is a firm alliance between the British and the Zionists. In 1936, an Arab revolt begins with a general strike in Jaffa. Britain declares martial law. It dissolves the existing Arab governance structure. More than 5,000 Arabs were killed. 15,000 were injured in the suppression of the revolt. And in general, the feeling was that the sympathy of the world was shifting away from the Arab demands. What did Britain do? Britain said, our mandate's over, goodbye. So what happened? Well, Britain declares its mandate is over and puts its troops on the boats and goes home and says to the United Nations, well, you take care of this. So having created a tremendous amount of turmoil, and as I say, it's hard to run an empire. They just decide, well, the UN, that's a new organization. Why don't you take this over?
Yeah. It's absolutely amazing that the UK could do something that irresponsible.
Never happened.
Never happened
before. That's why things are always so quiet in, India and Pakistan.
Afghanistan.
Yeah. And
Ireland.
Exactly.
India.
They really know how to see things through to a peaceful ending, don't they? They turn the problem over to the UN, and the UN recommends a partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and declares Jerusalem basically an international city, which still makes sense to me, frankly. This is rejected by the Arabs because, on the one hand, most of the land was given to the Zionists, even though the largest population are Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And they live there. So the inequity of the distribution was one thing that was at issue. And the Arab nations surrounding Palestine gave the Palestinians assurances that rejecting partition, they would support it militarily. So they do. There's a war, and the Arab armies simply couldn't defeat the new Jewish state. Israel declares itself a state in 1948 and organizes an army, and it can't be defeated. So now what happens is pretty ugly, because the Israelis start to go into villages that are Palestinian villages, obviously, and decimate them. They burn them down. There's rape and pillage. It's not a great moment in the history of Israel. And many Palestinians decide that they're going to leave, which they do. And that's how we wind up where we are today. Countries that might have stepped forward to assist in providing land that would allow the Palestinians to create a state did not. And so you now have this enormous stateless population clinging to the Gaza Strip and clinging to the West Bank. And all of the territories that were originally offered to the Palestinians as a result of this plan for partition are now controlled by Israel. And that's why sometimes you hear people refer to it as occupied territory. 750,000 Palestinians fled or were escorted out of the territory. And the question of how to resolve it, of course, exists to today. And I won't rehearse all the different wars and all the different efforts to bring peace. But what I do want to get to is this is how the UNRWA was founded. When this expulsion of the Palestinians occurred, the UN set up a relief organization explicitly and solely for the Palestinians. And one of the complaints that Israel has against the UNRWA, probably a reasonable complaint from their point of view. I'm not saying I agree, but from their point of view, they're pretty virulent on this. I've heard some interviews, and the level of agitation and anger is deep, because one of the things that the relief organization oversees is education in the Palestinian territories.
Right.
And they contract with local groups to produce the textbooks and the other educational material that's used. Well, in those schools, the opportunity is taken by the teachers to tell the students and to get them loyal to the idea of return, the right of return. And the right of return refers to the original Balfour Agreement. The rights of the Palestinians would be recognized. And it gave the Palestinians literally the right of return. Well, it was a long time ago, let's face it. But this notion that they should have the right to return to land that their forebears owned is very much part of what's taught in the schools. The symbol for it is a key. In other words, the way in which this message is conveyed is to talk about how families, when they left their homes, turned the key in the lock and took the key with them because they assume they're coming back. And so the notion of the key has become a symbol. It's become part of children's literature. It's become part of poems that are read. In other words, it's very much inculcated, even though the land that their forefathers inhabited, those villages don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not there. Well, the notion of the right to return is therefore part of what students are being taught in school. This is interpreted, of course, in Israel as part of the design to just get rid of Israel. And you remember during the student demonstrations where some of the Arab students or Muslim students were saying from the river to the sea, that this was immediately taken up as meaning the destruction of the state of Israel. And then some of the students, I think, disingenuously said, no, it just means we want to go back and be able to live. It doesn't prove to be a path to peace. And given the extremists in the area, it doesn't actually satisfy what they say, which is they want the destruction of the state of Israel. So that's one complaint that Israel has had against the UNRWA, that they're not more involved in the curriculum in the schools. Okay. But then there came this substantive allegation from Israel in December of 2024 that Hamas was teaching in those schools. And that not only was Hamas teaching in those schools, but they were involved in the attack on Israel. And they provided documentary evidence of this, that there were various principals, teachers in 24 different schools where members of Hamas or the Islamic Jihad were in charge of these schools. Now, it's not clear that they were in charge, but it's clear that they'd infiltrated. And they did release the documents to provide evidence of this. New York Times carried a very long article on it. But they had a hard time tracing it all down, even though, despite that difficulty, there seemed to be sufficient evidence that some of the people involved in attacking were working for UNRWA and were involved in the schools in the UNRWA. So that's the basis of the allegation that Israel stopped any activity of the UNRWA to bring humanitarian aid in. And you remember they set up the food distribution centers themselves where they shot people who came to get food.
As we mentioned earlier, Hamas is the bureaucracy that distributes and basically structures social activity in Gaza. It would be peculiar if any sort of distribution agency, educational agency, administrative agency did not interact in some way or have some membership of people who subscribe to these particularly violent considerations of Palestinians' right to return as being more than the return of, villages that aren't there anymore. It goes back to the quote you cited earlier. Who's going to distribute this? Who's going to have the purity of heart that would satisfy Israel, who's already there? I mean, this can't be done by me, you. It certainly can't be done by Jared Kushner or Tony Blair. I mean, this is the absurdity and the magical thinking of it all. If you're going to deliver food aid, the people who are there are going to have to distribute the food aid. If you don't like the people who are there, you don't like the people who are there. Going and picking and finding one you like is a ridiculous criteria when people are starving to death.
Well, precisely, and they've not acted in good faith, as far as anybody can tell, because it's the declaration of famine in the northern part of Gaza has been fairly clear. I don't think anybody questions it, except Netanyahu when he's talking to his own people. With regard to that, I saw a very interesting piece that I need to follow up on. But the piece was about footage that Israel released showing lots of fresh fruit and vegetables and food in a marketplace somewhere in Gaza to say, everything's fine there. And the allegation was, those pictures were taken after one of the times that Israel actually was allowing food in, but that the price of the food being sold was very high and most people couldn't afford it, which goes back to your inquiry into the economy. Okay, so that's the background. And whether or not it's a purely propaganda piece, I'll do more research on. But the allegation was a complaint was filed with YouTube, which is now owned by Google, to say, this ought to violate your standards because it's misinformation. It's not presenting the whole truth. And Google's response was, no, it doesn't rise to the level of a violation. So the question, for a media person, the question has to do with how information is monitored or not monitored, how it's released. Along the same lines, when I was doing the preparation for this, I watched quite a few YouTube accounts, the history of Israel, the history of the Palestinians in the Palestinian territory, and I was surprised at how many of them just left out mentioning the partition as a possibility, including Al Jazeera, which kind of surprised me because even though Al Jazeera's sympathies are clear, its news is usually pretty good.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there were these accounts of Muslims who had come to their senses and become Christians. And that's being put out by various Christian networks who, of course, are thrilled at the idea of Israel as a precursor to the second coming of Christ. So,
okay, now we're really drifting into magical thinking.
Yeah, we are, but that's not my point. My point really is the amount of interest in framing this story to serve a certain kind of historical narrative should not be laid entirely at the feet of Israel.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we talked about earlier the fact that the magical thinking is also part of feeding this to the American public. In other words, we see narratives being constructed that are simplistic or visual representations that are simplistic, which are not capturing the reality of what is going on there. And this actually seems like a further degradation of the media in terms of the quality of their coverage of things. You used to at least see documentaries that would raise some questions.
Yes.
There used to be something other than, a few magazines that only you and I read, the other people used to read, like, The Atlantic.
Well,
where you're getting any serious coverage of this.
Well, the major networks, in fact, anything licensed by the federal government, were released from the requirements that led to those really interesting documentaries they used to present by the same legislation that came out during the Reagan years that we've talked about, where the market became the determiner of what constituted the public interest. If people watched it, then the public interest was being served. So that the public interest requirement, which was that a certain number of hours be devoted to news and information that was not part of the rating system for the network, that just went away. And they folded the news into the entertainment segment, so it's ratings driven.
Well, that means that anything as complex as this or anything that isn't pretty isn't going to get on the news because it might upset the viewer and get them to change the channel, and that would affect.
Precisely.
Yeah,
and so
move to another service.
You don't want to give multiple causes for multiple highly complex situations because, quite frankly, they don't think we could understand it or follow it. So.
Well, certainly considering the people that they're hiring to present it sometimes indicates that that's the case.
Yes.
when you consider the fact that we have several 24 hours news services, and yet they're not filling their time with any news coverage.
No,
They're chatting about pictures in Time magazine or what Kim Kardashian wore yesterday.
Well, there is a lot of time spent on analysts sitting around a table commenting, which is not the same thing as news gathering. And the amount of money spent by networks on news gathering, that is, reporters and correspondents, has dramatically declined since the Reagan years. So that it's expensive to send people out to do reporting from the field. And of course, it's compounded in this case by Israel not allowing reporters into Gaza. But, you know, if you compare what you see on BBC, and I would argue even Al Jazeera, they're much more grounded in their reporting, and they're also there. I mean, they're on the ground there. But no, I don't disagree with you at all. There's been a tendency away from an informed public, which is why this kind of magical thinking going on right now can happen. You can have people of the caliber of J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, and Jared Kushner has never been elected to an office in his life, pretending like, oh, now we just have to go solve the problem of phase 2. Really? Do we? That's all you have to do is just go talk to Netanyahu and that'll happen? And also just being able to glibly say, after meeting with Netanyahu, well, we're not going to let the Palestinian Relief Group deliver food? No. Well, who's going to do it then? And when?
And on that happy note, no, seriously, I mean, the magical thinking makes people think they know what's going on.
Yes.
At the same time, they're really totally unaware of what's going on. And the fact that the people who are now in charge are engaged in magical thinking, or at least our half of them, allows this to happen.
I agree. I also think they're not as interested in presenting news stories in a context, like how did we get to here?
Yeah.
Newspapers traditionally have done that, but newspapers are going out of business at a rather rapid rate. However, it is still possible to know if you go look for it. But I just don't think the will is there to go find it.
It's not so easy anymore. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, when I began teaching, every day I would have the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal on my desk. And the reporting in those papers was good.
Yeah.
And now, you know, I can't get that unless I'm willing to go online, buy subscriptions, and get through firewalls. And
Well, and I'll tell you something interesting for me, maybe not for you. This may be a sign of, again, my age, but I subscribe to the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the Times. Mm-hmm. And I open up my screen, and I just don't get the amount of information I would get when I had a physical newspaper in front of me. I don't know if that's just me, and I don't know how to navigate the screens as well, or if it's something physical about a newspaper where you're reading one article and the article right next to it's interesting, so you read that one too. I don't know what's the difference is. But
you want the truth of this?
Yeah.
You're looking at that little tiny screen there, and you're old and you can't make it big enough so that you can see it.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
No, but I understand, you know, to make these things easy to consume, you go to your New York Times page and you click on an article and it takes you there. And then at the bottom, with the commercials, they might tell you about a related article.
Yes.
But, you know, it is difficult to navigate if you're trying to do research, as we do for this show every week.
We have made it to our depressing end. Well, once again, we've failed to cheer each other up. I hope our loyal listener gained something from it. And next week, we'll see what's going on, and we'll depress each other again.
In our times.
in our times.